Hey, it's Rob B here with Rob D, and you are listening to the Property Podcast. We get asked questions time and time again, like, what's happening to the 18-year property cycle? What's better, flats or houses? Why is Rob B the best Rob? And when is it finally time to invest in London? And today, we are going to answer that question.
Yes, welcome to the Property Podcast. Thank you for joining us. We are taking a deep dive into the data this week and finding some results that we were definitely not expecting when we first came up with the idea for this episode. So do make sure you stick around. And also, if you're not already, make sure you're subscribed to our free weekly newsletter, Property Pulse, where we round up all the week's big property news for you. You can sign up for free at propertyhub.net/pulse.
It's time for our news story of the week, or it should be news stories of the week, because there's so much going on at the moment. I'm glad we have this segment to keep you updated. And the big one, the one I'm sure you have not missed, is that interest rates were frozen. Yes, we had, and I didn't realise this, 14 straight increases. I didn't realise it was that many. 14 straight, which is incredible. But the Bank of England decided to hold at 5.25%, which is still their highest for 15 years. It's been a long time. It's the last property cycle since we saw interest rates at this level. Historically, not super high. Historically, this is normal. But in recent times, this is a lot higher than we're used to. Now, it was very close to being a rate increase. The Bank of England have a vote, and it was split. 5 members voting to hold rates and 4 voting for an increase. So very, very tight. But we'll take it. On a personal note, I'm pleased to see this because I believe that interest rates take a while to have an impact on the economy. And yes, you have the immediate sentiment shift of a rate change, but you also then need time to see what impact these interest rates take. And depends on who you listen to or who you believe, but that can take, 6 to 9 months. So for me, this seems wise. And hopefully, Rob, this is the new peak. And there is talk, although what we've learned is things change all the time, but currently there is talk that this could just be left at this rate for the foreseeable future. So it may not fall quickly, but hopefully, this could be the end of the increases.
It seems likely, and if we've learned anything from the last few years, it's that you can't say anything for certain. But it really does seem likely that this is the peak, and especially the peak for mortgage rates, because mortgage rates, of course, are forward-looking. So they're not just looking at what rates are today, but they're looking at what rates might be over the term of the loan. And when rates are just going up and up and up, like you say, 14 consecutive increases, they're going to be thinking, well, there's probably going to be a few more in here. So the fixed rate that ends up getting charged to you is higher. Now it seems that interest rates have likely peaked. Maybe there'll be another surprise one in there if they get a scary month of data next time, who knows? But if not the peak of interest rates, it's very close to it, which means we've probably seen peak mortgage rates. Swap rates, which is effectively a bank's cost of funding, which is what mortgages are priced on, have come down substantially over the last month. And we've already started to see some major lenders cutting rates, even before the Bank of England decided to hold rates in place last week. So you've got to be careful, Rob, about sounding too definitive, but it's been an awful year if you're involved in the mortgage market. But it seems like the pain might be coming to an end.
We will all cross our fingers and toes. Something that came out the blue, for me anyway, and a news story you may have missed, but in the world of property, it seems almost as big, is that the government has scrapped the Home Energy Task Force. Now, that in itself doesn't sound anything exciting, but it does have a big impact, Rob, for landlords.
Yeah, for years it's been believed that any rental property is going to require an EPC grade C in order to continue being rented out. This has never been law or policy, by the way. It's always been proposals. People seem to think it was definitely going to happen, but it only ever got to the consultation stage. It was originally planned for 2025 and then got pushed back to 2028. Now, gone. So as of right now, if you've got a property that's got at least a grade E, no need to upgrade. Of course, Rob, this is something that Rishi Sunak has announced. If we're talking about probabilities again, it seems likely that he and his party won't be in a position to make decisions about this kind of thing for much longer. So it's possible that something similar will be brought back in the next parliament. But if it is, then you've got to think it'll either have a more realistic deadline or target attached to it, because as we've said in the past, the previous suggestion was just never going to work. But we have had so many questions over the last couple of years about this into Ask Rob and Rob, into our Sunday Times column. So we know that a lot of property investors will be very happy about this story.
You know what would give us a happy moment is some lovely positive reviews. So if you are enjoying the podcast, we don't ask for payment, no Patreon here, just good vibes. So if you want to send some good vibes over wherever you listen to your podcast, whether it be on Spotify or iTunes or on the Apple Podcast app or wherever else, leave a review. We really appreciate it. The upgrade on that for super positive vibes, and I can assure you the universe will reward you for this, is sharing the podcast with others. But as an easy win to make you and us both feel great, is leave a positive review wherever you consume your podcasts. I thank you in advance.
Over the years that we've been presenting this podcast, we've seen a huge migration of investors from the southeast up further north. And that's because London prices hit a point where it just didn't make sense to invest anymore. But as we've reported extensively over the last few years, London has consistently been the worst performing region for house price growth. And, as we've also reported, rents in London have been growing faster than anywhere else, which must mean that yields are improving and London's becoming more attractive for property investment again. So is it time to buy in London? For all our listeners in the southeast, do you finally get to buy it closer to home? And are we even going to see the reverse of the previous migration, where investors from further north decide it's time to buy up a bit of the capital? Well, Rob, we've been diving into the data to answer this question, and the findings are fascinating.
They are. And this is a bit of a selfish episode because we've been saying for a little while, we're keeping an eye on London. We're keeping an eye on it because at some point, after a market performs poorly for a while, there becomes value. So by digging into this data, we'll answer our own question, which is, should we be keeping a very close eye on London? Should we be making moves soon? And is there value there yet? Now, we talked about the secret property crash a few episodes back, and I highly, highly recommend that you go and listen to that episode. And we discussed how in real terms, so that's property prices when you take into account inflation, are actually way below the trend line when you look at the UK as an average. So we wanted that data for London, and unfortunately, it doesn't exist. There is no public data that we could find, at least anyway, that shows how property prices are performing in real terms for London. But having a property geek as part of your team reaps rewards occasionally. And Mr. D, you've done a great job because you've got the data yourself and plotted a chart, which we will share in the show notes for you to see and access yourself. So this is definitely one of those episodes that you'll want to refer back to the show notes so you can see some of the visuals. But the charts immediately start to tell a story. The UK chart, and then more importantly, the London chart.
Yeah, so let's have a great bit of audio where I describe a chart to you. So if you look at the UK chart of real house prices, basically what you see if you go and look at it is a giant run up from 2000 to 2007. Not a surprise. Then you'll see a fall from 2008. Not a surprise there either. And then since then, it's been basically flat. And that's why, as we discussed in that silent property crash episode, real house prices across the UK as a whole are, believe it or not, the same today as they were back in 2013. So Rob, that's the picture for the whole of the UK. But as we found after we put the chart together, it looks a little bit different for London.
It does look a bit different, but as you'd expect, the chart does do some things on a similar level. So growth from 2000, a dip in 2008, but then the recovery is much quicker than the rest of the UK. And from about 2012-ish, it shoots up, almost straight up, and it doesn't even appear to have a Brexit dip. Now, this graph shows a couple of things. One, how resilient London is, and we'll talk about why London is attractive as an investment destination in a little while, but also how unaffordable it is. But that's just on a basic level. You can look at this at a deeper level, and that's what we've done today.
Yeah, there's another way of looking at this, which is comparing London to the rest of the country. So I put together another chart that shows the average price of property in the north as a proportion of the average price of property in London. So I basically took the prices for the north, northwest and Yorkshire regions and averaged them together and plotted that against London. And what that shows is that back in 1997, you could get 3/4 of a London property for the price of a northern property. So London was still more expensive, but not dramatically so. But just 3 years later, in the year 2000, this had fallen to 0.4% of a London property for the price of a northern property. In other words, London property now costs more than double. It got a lot more relatively expensive. And if you track the ratio over time, London actually got even more expensive. So London was at its most expensive relative to the north in 2017, when it hit 0.3. And that's basically because, as we just saw, the rest of the country had the crash and then flatlined, whereas London had the crash, not even much of a crash, and then rapidly kicked on again. As a result, London became at its most expensive relative to the north. Now, over the last few years, that ratio has been improving, so it's now at 0.38, which is round about where it was in the year 2000. But even though the ratio is improving, if you go all the way back to the 70s, it's still very, very expensive compared to the rest of the country by historical standards. So that relative lack of value in London, and there being more value for investors in the north that we talked about at the beginning, still very much the case despite the last couple of years. If you know anything about our service, Property Hub Invest, it's probably that we secure you exclusive property deals at a discount. But I now make all my investments through Property Hub Invest. And what I value most is actually the time saving and having the care team on hand to deal with developers, mortgage brokers, solicitors, all the things that normally cause so much stress and take up so much headspace. Property investment will never be effortless, but having the expert team at Property Hub Invest makes it so much easier. If you're interested in finding out more about Property Hub Invest, just go to propertyhub.net/invest.
So this begs the question, why would anybody invest in London? Well, it's a truly famous city, like New York, Paris, Hong Kong, Sydney. It's got status. Everybody knows it. It's absolutely famous. Because of that, of course, tourism is absolutely huge. Being in central London, at least the touristy areas in the summer, is a bit bonkers. It's one of the biggest cities in the world. And on many levels, financially, it is one of the most important cities in the world. So huge employment, infrastructure, ongoing investment. It never ends. The government always seems to find money for London. It may struggle for elsewhere in the country, hint, hint, government, if you're listening. But London never seems to struggle. The recent Crossrail project is a prime example of that. It's incredible, that infrastructure and what's been done there. And of course, because it is famous, it appeals to the international market. It's a place of stability. It's a safe haven for those investors. The pound is also really weak and continues to get weaker. So international investors feel a bit more comfortable with London. They might not be as brave to invest in the rest of the UK if they've never lived in the UK, because they might not have heard of Birmingham. I know, as crazy as that sounds, they just might not have. So for all those reasons, you can see why people would invest in London. And over the long term, it is a safe bet. It's just that we know, and you know listening, that in the short to medium term, there are absolutely stronger options out there and better places to invest your money. And unless you're emotionally attached to investing in London, you probably should look at those other areas.
Well, yes, I suppose you could say so. I think you could say that if you're dead set on buying in London, it's for whatever reason, emotional, practical, whatever it is, the only place you're going to consider investing, then you could take heart that things are improving. So as the ratio between London and the north shows, that was at its worst in 2017, and it's been improving since then. So you can go, okay, I'm going to buy now. It's not great, but I've locked in my price. Rents are going to go up. It's all good. But that really is an argument you'd only be making to comfort yourself if for some reason you had to buy in London. On the whole, though, as we found, it's not the time to buy in London right now. And I was actually surprised by this. I thought when we started putting this together, there would be more of an argument for buying in London now. I thought the last 5 years or so would have seen more of an adjustment that would have made it easier to make the case for buying in London. But it's not. Now, clearly, based on the data we've looked at, it's not the time. But at some point, it will be time again. But how will we know, Rob? But how will we know when it is time to buy in London?
Well, the quick answer here is after the next crash. Because we've seen this in the last two cycles, that after the UK property market collapses, London recovers the quickest. And it is very quick, and it bounces back very strongly. Now, when will that crash happen? I don't think we're going to see it in the foreseeable future. What we're having is a silent property crash, as we've talked about many times over the last few months. So London in the short term doesn't look like a place, certainly, that myself and many others would invest in. Another scenario where London could become interesting again, though, is if prices continue to fall. Now, we have to remember that the UK average property price is down right now, but some areas are growing because it's an average. You'll have some areas performing and some areas underperforming. And London and the South East are performing the worst right now. So if we continue to have high inflation for the next few years and London property prices continue to fall, then maybe we don't need that crash, that trigger that we've had in previous years to make London attractive again. It might happen, who knows? But that is another scenario that could take place where London becomes interesting. And that's why we talk about it, right? Because London is such an important city. I've already talked about that already, and it is a safe bet over the long term. If you invest in London today, will you have done well over the next 10, 20 years? Absolutely. Is it the best place to invest today? No. But if you're in it for the long term, you're only going to ever invest in London. Don't wait for a crash. Don't wait for the market to soften for another few years. Just get in, because being out of the market is much worse. Just doing nothing is the worst decision you can make as an investor.
Yes, exactly. So when we do have the next crash, then you'd expect yields everywhere to improve, because rents tend not to fall when there's a property crash, but prices obviously do. So yields improve across the board. But in London, you've got better yields and you've got this appeal of being the capital city, a global city, a safe bet over the long term, as you said earlier. So that alone could be enough to attract people back in. Something else I've been thinking about recently is that I think you could make the argument that property in London is more financialized than homes in the rest of the country. Like it or not, London property is an international investment asset class, which is a big part of the reason why London bounced back so strongly from the last crash. It became a safe haven for international investors to come and put their cash. And that's true for London in a way that it's just not for rural Scotland or wherever. So I think that's a strong argument for why London will bounce back the strongest from the next crash, whenever that is. And given that when we get the next crash, the response to that is likely to be a whole lot of government stimulus, well, that's all the more reason why London could bounce back first and fastest. So I don't know, that's only speculation. But when we do have that crash, I'm suddenly going to be getting very interested in what's going on in London, because that could see you lock in an entry point that sees you doing extremely well over the coming years.
Yeah, I agree. And unless there's a pretty major market correction and London drops significantly, it is really hard to make the numbers work, especially when you compare it to other parts of the UK. And if prices did drop, it would be a flash sale, like we've seen in the other charts. You don't get that buying window for long, because London, the fundamentals are ridiculously strong. So when it's cheap, the smart money goes in. So it doesn't last long. Now, it's not weeks or months. It might be a couple of years. But in property, that's not actually a long buying window. That's quite small, especially when you think about how long it takes to buy a property. So it's not a big buying window, but we will have it again. Of course, the alternative is if property prices continue to slump over the next few years, not crash, but just fall slowly, and we get that big inflation, maybe that's another window. We will see. So overall, there is no dispute. London is amazing. It's an incredible city, both to live, work in, and invest in. Are there other places you can do all of those things as well in the UK? Absolutely. Will we be investing right now? As we've said, no. But we will patiently wait, and we will keep our eye on it, because when the London opportunity comes around, it's irresistible. And of course, by listening to this podcast, we will announce when we feel that place is getting close. We will announce when we feel that's about to happen. And we will share with you when we change our investment strategy. And then if you want to follow along, you are absolutely welcome to. That's what I love, right? We just tell you what we see and what we're doing and where we're investing. And then you can decide whether, yeah, guys, I'm on board with you. I completely buy into what you're doing. Or, yeah, I'll take a little bit of it and ignore the rest. We don't mind. It's fine. But we feel that by just sharing our insights, sharing what we do, how we invest, and what we're seeing in the market, hopefully it helps you make better investment decisions.
Okay, on to Hub Extra, where we give you that little bit more, a little tip, a resource, a tool before we send you on your way. And this week, a resource to help you treat yourself a little bit. So urban.co is the site, and it's a site that makes it really easy to book a massage therapist to come to your home. So I haven't done this, but I've got friends who have, and they said it's amazing. Because if you suddenly decide you want a massage in an hour's time, you can book someone, they'll turn up with the table and everything you need, get set up and give you that treatment without you having to leave your home. And you can get osteopath and physio treatments as well. So I haven't tried this yet, Rob, but I'll be looking for an excuse to as soon as I can.
Yeah, I'd highly recommend seeing an osteopath. As someone who's quite tall, my back is constantly giving me trouble. And seeing an osteopath was a game changer for me. I just wish I'd started it sooner. It's not something you typically do, like, I'll have my cereal and then, I'll book in to see an osteopath. It's not something you normally do. If you're already doing it, you'll know how valuable this can be. But an osteopath is a kind of hub extra. If you ever have any aches or pains, seeing an osteopath can make a real difference. It's made a real difference for my life. So there's a little Brucey bonus for you.
Well, there you go. That's us done for another week. Thank you for joining us. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. Please do share if you can think of someone else you know who'd get value from this show. Remember, you can find us in the Sunday Times at the weekend, and then we'll see you back here next Thursday for the next episode of the Property Podcast. Have a great week. Bye-bye.